The roads are mostly dirt tracks or long stretches of highway with nothing but gum trees and kangaroos for company. They're alright in the day, but at night, you gotta watch out for them because they'll jump out into the road and scare the living daylights out of you. Now, it's nice and quiet though, really quiet in fact, and there are never any jams, only ever the odd tractor holding you up and those that you can just pass. But that means we charge much less for much longer journeys, considering a simple run to the shop could be 25 Ks each way. Fuel prices are a killer, same with the heat in the summer and the fog in the winter that makes driving legitimately dangerous. But there's a real sense of freedom and community that I wouldn't give up for anything. Everyone knows everyone, so chats in the cab are sometimes like catching up with old friends. Lots of runs or locals headed to town for groceries, doctor appointments, or to visit family. You'll get the occasional farmer who's banned for drink driving as well, so every so often you'll get a stretch of picking up a Ned in an Akubra and work boots who's off to the sale yards or to pick up some supplies. And then once his band is all served up, he says his goodbyes, but you stay mates. And then there are the older people who don't drive anymore, and I'll take them to bingo or the pub for a yarn. Tourists pop up now and then, wanting a lift to the national parks or the wineries, and back to the airport once they're all done and dusted. It's all pretty laid back. You end up hearing some ripper stories along the way, and you end up getting to know pretty much everyone as you go about your travels. But that means when you pick up someone new, it's almost like a special occasion. You don't go being nosy and all of that and start prying into their personal lives, but there's definitely an element of, well, who's this guy then? And it was no different the time that I got a job picking a fare up from a pub late at night, and a pub that I was very familiar with and I'd never seen him before. This guy's wearing a black hoodie, dark jeans, and work boots, and he's come staggering out of the pub, and right off I'm assuming that it's someone that I know who's had a skinful. I'm smiling to myself thinking, who's this clown? But when he gets in the cab, I realize that, like I said, he's a total stranger. Now I start dialing it back, right? Because I'm about to start joking around and saying, what are you thinking, you bloody dickhead? The wife's gonna have your balls for earrings. You just look at the stadia. But then I can't say that to a total stranger now, can I? So I dial it back, wish him a good evening, mate, and all of that, and then ask him where he's off to. Now, the guy says he's headed to his mate's house, and he sounds pretty sauced when he tells me he's not 100% sure where it is. But if I take him to this one particular road about 20 minutes drive away, he'll be able to direct me from there. It turns out he wasn't from around there, which is why he didn't know the area very well. But that wasn't a problem at all, and I promised that I'd get him where he was going, even if it did require a little bit of teamwork. He didn't seem all that talkative, but that was fine by me. Not everyone fancies a chat. But I did have to convince him to take his hood down so I could actually see his face. It was dark out, and he had this hood right up over his head so I couldn't make out his face, and I joked that he was making me nervous, and he did take his hood down, but he didn't laugh or really anything. Now, he was just deadpan, with his dark hair and eyes, and he also looked like not that much older than a kid, to the point where if I had to guess, I'd have said that he couldn't have been a day older than maybe 22. He was just a kid, so while he was acting a bit weird and moody, I wasn't scared or anything, not at all. Anyway, we got to the road that he wanted me to drive him to, this really long one with houses on either side, spaced out, mind you, and one that led deep into the bush. Now we're driving down and I'm slowing at each house asking him, this one? But each time he shakes his head and asks me to drive further down the road. Now I thought it was pretty funny at first, thinking that this guy had been so smashed when he'd been to his mates and that he genuinely couldn't remember where it was. But then after going past maybe 5 or 6 different houses over the course of about half a mile, like I said, spaced out, I asked him if he was sure that this was the road that he was after. Now he just mumbled something about how we needed to keep going, and then after I think 3 or 4 more houses, we stopped seeing any and it was just bushland on either side of the road for maybe another half a mile. Now this was after he told me to keep going and how his mate's house must have been at the end of it. Now I knew we couldn't find anything because I knew the road, but the customer's always boss here, as they say, so I drove him all the way down till there was nothing but trees in front of us to show him how that there was nothing there. I told him, well, there you go, mate, nothing there. Should we turn around or we just headed off-road? But all he did was mutter something about me switching off the car. I asked him to repeat himself, and he said that he wanted me to switch the engine off so we could talk. Now, I'm not adverse to a little heart-to-heart with a passenger. I mean, we're like mobile bartenders like that in a way, listening to people's problems, suggesting solutions, or just being the proverbial shoulder to cry on. But this guy was making me nervous. Call it a hunch, or just call it that I'm not keen on stinking drunk strangers, but I was a lot more wary than I normally have been if someone asked me to turn off the engine. But I did as he asked all the same, and then with just a hint of nervousness, I asked him what he wanted to talk about. Now, I turned around in my seat a bit so I could see him and saw a youngish guy with dark hair and dark squinty eyes who seemed very nervous about what he was going to say. I let him take his time and then tried to prompt him based off of his body language by saying, "You've been having some dark thoughts, have you, mate?" Now, he nodded, and I thought that I had it right on the money, but I didn't. I was slightly but crucially off. He told me that he'd been thinking about hurting people. Not himself, but others, and that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get all those dark thoughts out of his head. He felt angrier and angrier at the world with each passing day, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he hurt someone. And the longer he waited, the worse it got, to the point that he couldn't stop thinking about what it'd be like to kill someone. And that was my chance to get a word in, because I had a thing or two to say about what it meant to take a life. I told him it was something that he didn't want to know, and while he thought that he did because of how angry he was, he actually didn't know what he was asking for. I told him the dead come back to haunt those who take their lives, that ghosts are real, just not in the traditional floaty white sheet sort of way. I told him all that from the heart, from experience, but he didn't seem like he was listening, or rather, he just didn't agree. He told me that he'd heard all that stuff, all the old cliches, how it feels wrong in a way that can't be put into words, and he believed it too. It just hadn't changed his mind. He still wanted to cut someone up, feel how warm their blood is coming freshly out of their veins, and he wanted to watch the life drain from someone's eyes too, knowing that he was the one to do it. I told him he didn't know what he was talking about, that life wasn't a movie and that killing was a chaotic, messy, and terrible thing. And I'll never ever forget how when I said that last part about chaotic, terrible, and messy, that little bugger smiled. He kept a smile as he told me that that's what appealed to him, that he'd been thinking about it for so long that he couldn't take it anymore. He told me he had to kill someone, and that night was the night he was going to do it. Now there was this moment of quiet, him smiling and looking at me under his brow, and me just staring back at him thinking, this prick's gonna try and bump me off, isn't he? After giving me some little speech that he'd probably written in his mom's basement. Now I think he saw it in my face too, that he'd said too much, and I knew what he was planning, so he went for me. He pulled a knife from his hoodie, and then leaned forward between the two front seats and started slashing and stabbing at me with it. But his swings were wild, and with me leaning forward in my seat to reach under it, he only had an arm and my hip to stab at rather than my head and neck. I still wasn't safe though, not yet. But that kid couldn't have a single bloody clue who he was getting into that cab with. Not a single clue. Because he only got about 3 decent jabs into me before I pulled something up from under the seat, stuck it under my arm so the barrel was looking right at him, and then bang, bang, bang. It was all over. Now this was way back before Port Arthur and all the buyback stuff, so I was able to keep a handgun under my seat for anyone who tried to rob me, or in that case, worse. I'd also done 2 tours of East Timor in my 20s, when the fighting was at its worst too, so when I say I know what killing a man is like from first-hand experience, I'm not kidding. Killing a man in war, it's not a natural thing. People say it is, but it isn't. If it was, it wouldn't follow you around like a bad smell for the rest of your life, and you wouldn't think about the people you killed so often. If they had families, what they did before the war, and what they might have been doing after. A good man doesn't want to kill. He has to, and he spends the rest of his life wondering if he really had to do it, or if things might have been different, if this or that had or hadn't happened. But the lad in the back seat, he wasn't a good man. Or he wasn't even really a man, just a kid. But you know what I mean. He was a bad seed, born with the devil in him, as the old Nana used to say, and there was nothing else I could do but put him down like some dog. Now, I was hurt pretty bad, but I also knew that I needed the crime scene left exactly as is, so I ended up running to the first house that I could find and banging on the door. The people inside thought nothing of helping me out, stopping the bleeding and calling the police, and an ambulance showed up not long after, and I had to drive to the hospital to get stitches while the police took a look at the scene after I'd told them the whole story. It was a pretty open and shut case on their end. The kid still had a knife in his hand, leaning forward, and he'd been slashing so wildly that some of my seat was just completely shredded. Now, that wasn't even the only knife that he had on him either. He had another, a smaller one in the pocket of his jeans, and then an even smaller one jammed into the side of one of his boots. It was clear who the aggressor was, no doubt about it. And so there was no arrest, no court, nothing like that, just fair dinkum cobber and on you go. And now, that silly little bastard is just another one of the ghosts that follow me around, making me wonder why the bloody hell I didn't take that Friday night off. Driving for Uber in London was probably the lowest point of my entire life. It sounds harsh, and I'm not saying that there weren't upsides to it or that I didn't meet some unforgettable people while driving them around. It's more that I was forced into it after my first business went under, so I was in a really bad place mentally. And it was while driving Uber that I went through what might have been the scariest experience of my entire life. London is a mad city. Probably always has been that way and probably always will. I like being able to pick my own hours and log on to Uber whenever I fancied making a bit of cash. I could choose to only work peak hours too, because surging fares meant that I could make double or even triple what I might make during quieter periods. You meet all kinds of people too. Tourists, interesting locals, even celebrities sometimes. And if you're out chasing airport runs, you can make a tidy amount of money on chilled out runs while chatting about people's holidays, visits to family, whatever it is they're traveling for. You're your own governor, really. Just you, your motor, and the app. But it's not all sunshine and roses. London traffic can be an absolute nightmare. Half the time you're stuck in gridlock, burning through your petrol and your patience, especially when ULEZ charges nick a chunk of your earnings. Insurance rates are liable to go through the roof, and you gotta shell out for PHV license and checks, and if your car's playing up, then even more money down the drain. Competition is horrifically fierce too, and there's very little honor among drivers in that respect, and so sometimes you have to be extra quick on the draw to get a decent fare, or you could be waiting there for almost an hour trying to get on the scoreboard. And I'd say the very worst part of the job is the passengers. The bad ones, I mean. I'm not talking about the ones who complain or chat non-stop when I'm trying to concentrate on the road. I'm more talking about, in fact, well, let me just tell you the story and you'll see what I mean. So about a month before I threw in the towel and signed up to Universal Credit for a bit, I got this job taking some lads from Brixton down toward the Kingston Estates. They were quite a rowdy little trio who kept me waiting a few minutes before they piled into the back of my car. They couldn't have been older than maybe 25, but you can't tell with some of them. I've known a 17-year-old lad to look and talk like a bleeding 30-year-old, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. Now anyways, these younger lads pile into the back making jokes and being loud, but they weren't being threatening or intimidating or anything like that, just young and annoying. I confirmed where they were going, told them to fasten their seatbelts, always a good idea with young lads, otherwise they just don't, and then off we went towards the estates. The other thing that really annoyed me about that job was how they somehow picked rush hour of all times to request their Uber. You obviously get big fares from driving people around at those times, but it's so not worth it compared to late nights or even early mornings when everyone's rushing but tired. But sometimes when you're out, you're out. So it was better to take the job and be stuck in traffic making money rather than losing money. And so as expected, we hit a traffic jam pretty quickly and slowed to a stop surrounded by cars. The lads in the back are complaining, trying to backseat drive and all of that, and I wasn't a bell end to them or anything, but I said that they weren't getting charged any extra and they should just relax instead of giving it all that. Now they were chill, saying, "All right, mate, fair enough, we're good." And then we sat there for a few minutes, moving forward by a few cars every so often while we waited for our turn at the lights. The lads in the back were chatting away to themselves, and it sounded like they were looking out the window and pointing out at a passerby. Now they said, "Is that so-and-so?" And another said, "Yeah, it is." And then the first lad then said, "He's seen us. He's coming over." And this is when I turned round to see who was approaching the car, because the lad in the back sounded pretty nervous, like whoever it was didn't want to give him a very cheery hello. But when I turned in my seat and looked out the back window over my left shoulder, I just thought, bollocks. Because approaching my car was a lad on a bike, wearing a black ski mask and what looked like he was holding a freaking sword. Now I say sword, but it was more like a designer machete, if that makes sense. At least 1.5 feet long with a jet black blade, and it looked quite expensive actually, like a good bit of kit if you were off on a jungle trekking holiday. But this wasn't the Amazon. This was London, so as soon as I saw it, I knew something bad was about to happen. Now the first thing I did was lock my doors, and then the lads in the back started shouting, "Drive, drive, drive," but there was nowhere I could go. I kept telling them that I'd locked the doors and that the guy couldn't get him, but as he got closer and closer to the car, I realized a window wasn't going to stop him. The guy got off his bike and gridlocked traffic and started bashing my back window with the handle of the machete. I realized very quickly that they'd be trapped once that glass fell through, and that the guy on the opposite side needed to get out of the car and make room so the others could get out. I unlocked the door because there was a child lock in the back, and then started shouting at the guy in the back to get out and run. I shouted at him again and again to get out of the car, but it was like he was frozen. His eyes were glued to the window as the machete hammered on it until it suddenly smashed. The glass burst and flew into the car. It was only then that the guy in the back realized that he actually had to get out so his mates could actually escape too. But by then, it was a bit too late for the lad nearest to the machete. I don't know how many times he got stabbed before I finally just put my foot down and reversed into the car behind me. We hit bumper to bumper, and I thought that the lad in the back might make a run for it just like his mates had by then. But all he could do was clutch at all of his stab wounds trying to stop the bleeding. That and shout, "Please drive, please drive, please drive," over and over at me. Now everyone could see what was happening, and the cars on my right pretty much saved this lad's life by hanging back and giving me enough space to get out. And I suppose they didn't want their cars smashed because it was the only route that I had available, so if they clogged it up, they were going to need some work done. But they left it free all the same, and I was able to peel out of the gap at speed before taking it to a grass verge and overtaking all the waiting traffic. Now we're finally away from the guy with the ski mask and the machete, but there was still the matter of getting the lad in the back to the hospital, and even that wasn't the first thing on my mind. He was back there shouting, "Please, bruv, please take me to hospital, I don't want to die. Please don't let me die," and this other stuff that was sending my blood pressure through the bleeding roof. And I thank God that I knew the road so well by then too, because if they'd have been at the beginning of my stint driving Uber, I think I might have not actually known where to take him. But luckily, I was able to zoom him over to the nearest A&E where he was rushed inside and obviously made a priority patient because of all the stab wounds. I ended up staying in A&E for about an hour, waiting to hear back from a doctor that the lad was at least okay. Now obviously, I had to stay there to talk to the police as well because that's where they were coming to talk to the guy who'd been stabbed, but I really couldn't tell them all that much aside from where it had happened and what time. They thanked me and then waited around for a bit chatting until the doctor came out with the good news. The lad was going to be okay and he was awake and able to talk and all of that, and so the police were free to go and talk to him. I was able to go through too, just to be able to wish him all the best. I didn't stay long, I couldn't, but the level of gratitude he showed me from the hospital bed was something I'll never forget. I wasn't the one who saved his life. I was one of many people who contributed to saving it, but the way he thanked me for saving my life, it makes me quite emotional to think about it today. He kept thanking me even as I walked off with a lump in my throat, and I had to properly pull myself together when I went back outside. I couldn't take my cab because the police wanted it for forensics, so I had to call a cab of my own for once to get home and tell my girlfriend everything that had happened. I got my car back in a couple of days, which was nice, and I was never so glad to have paid for that big insurance policy prior to working for Uber because it meant I got hazardous materials covered by the plan and didn't have to pay a thing to have it cleaned. I wasn't even going to take out such an expensive plan at first because it really is like insane rates at the minute to get private hire cabs covered in London. But the two pieces of advice I got from another driver were, 1, When in doubt, cancel the fare. And 2, upgrade your insurance because people are nasty and leave all sorts of mess in your car. I thought I could avoid it by picking my fares carefully, and I still took his advice and upgraded my plan. And oh my God, was I glad I did, because it saved me so much of a headache I can't even imagine. I didn't last much longer after that. I wasn't traumatized or anything, I just knew that I should pack it all in before my luck really ran out, if you know what I mean. And I started a second business earlier than planned and then worked 70-hour weeks for just shy of 2 months until it started to break even. And after that, it was onwards and upwards in a weird way, and it was like something good came out of something bad, because being so determined to stay off the roads and make something of myself was what I needed to make a success of myself. As a younger man, I used to drive taxis around my home city of Belfast. But driving taxis in Belfast during the 80s was a lot different to driving taxis anywhere else. Because this was at the height of the Troubles during the 80s, meaning Belfast was a very, very violent place to live and work. You'd hear about bombings and shootings on the radio, sometimes on a daily basis, and it got horribly normal to be driving along, minding your own business, and suddenly come across a British Army patrol and their Saracens, all armed to the teeth and looking angry. It was a scary time, but you had no choice but to carry on bringing home the bacon because we all had people depending on us. Some came close to some pretty nasty ends while out on the roads. Fellow cab drivers, I mean, though. But some came closer than others, myself included. On a very drizzly Tuesday in 1981, I was out on the roads picking up fares. I've been on the road since tea time, having done a few runs into the city center and back. And then around 10 o'clock, I was cruising along the Falls Road edge on my way to Anderson Town to pick up a fare. Now, the drive took a little bit shorter than usual, as I was mostly driving down empty back streets, and since I was starting to feel a bit tired, I remember telling myself that that was the last stop for the night. And remembering that gives me a dark sort of chuckle these days. I got to the pickup spot, which was the car park of the old swimming pool before it all got done. But when I pulled in, there was no one to be seen anywhere. Now I'm thinking the fella's inside the building, that he's a member of staff who needs to set the alarm and lock up, so to save petrol, I turned off my engine while I waited for him. 1 minute goes by, then 2, then 3, and still no one appears from the pool building. I started getting a little bit impatient, thinking that I'll just give him a few more minutes good grace and then I'm off-ski. I remember tapping my wheel, looking out my driver's window at a car that got my attention, and that's when the shooting started. The window screen shattered, glass was flying everywhere, and then one by one I started feeling the hits. First in the shoulder, like a hammer smashing bone, and then the chest, knocking the wind out of me. I got another in the leg, and that one was the worst, and it felt like someone had shoved a red-hot poker right to the bone. And the car was getting riddled. The panels were buckling, the tires were popping, and all the while I'm trying to make myself as small as possible, practically ducked down into the footwell trying to climb inside the engine. And it was only when it stopped that I started thinking, why me? What did I do? I was just driving a taxi trying to make an honest wage. Who the hell did they think I was? And the pain was everywhere. And somehow I was still conscious and gasping for air, because the shooting had stopped and I was still alive, and I thought that maybe I'd gotten off easy. I knew I still had a mountain to climb in terms of getting myself help, because I could feel everywhere that I'd been shot, and I knew that I had to get to a hospital. But there was also this mad feeling of relief knowing that I was over the worst of it, and it was all technically uphill from there. Unfortunately for me, that wasn't exactly true, and as I tried scrambling back into the driver's seat, I heard the footsteps on the concrete outside. I looked up just in time to see a man in a balaclava pointing a pistol through the window, and it wasn't quite like my life flashed in front of my eyes, but I did quite clearly see an image in my mind of my wife and kid at home, crying when they got the news. The gunman leans in a bit more, so he's pointing this gun right at my head with the barrel inches from me. I remember his eyes, how they were a lighter shade of either blue or green, and I remember how much hatred was in them. I've never seen anyone so angry at me in all of my life, not before and not since. And this monster didn't even know me. At least I'm 90% sure he didn't, and to him, I was just another Protestant. He had no hesitation whatsoever in pulling that trigger, but when he did, nothing. The gun had jammed. Now, it was a miracle or a complete coincidence, depending on how you look at it, but again, it wasn't over. The guy starts fumbling with the gun, trying to make it shoot. I saw a bullet pop out when he did something like slap it or pull at it, and then he tried again, aiming his gun toward my head and pulling the trigger. But again, the gun didn't fire. I was laying there, sort of leaning against the seat, watching it all like it was in slow motion as he tried once again to make his gun work. Blood's pooling up under me, my vision is blurring, and I remember listening to him muttering to himself, just properly desperate to get it working so he can blow my brains out up close. He didn't get a chance, though, because one of his mates suddenly appears and grabs his arm, and then he shouted, "Leave it!" and both of them ran off. They knew the RUC would be on the way, the police I mean, and while it must have been only a minute or so before I heard their sirens, I'm sure you understand when I say that it felt like an eternity. The last thing I remember was blue flashing lights and then just this big blank space between that and waking up in a hospital bed with machines beeping and nurses fussing over me. The doctor said I was very lucky and that the bullets only missed all my vital bits by a matter of millimeters in some places, but I'd lost a lot of blood, and my shoulder was shattered and needed pins, and my leg was fractured. But the worst part was the chest wound. It had collapsed the lungs, so I needed a tube put in to drain all the fluid. And seeing all that and feeling it too was probably the worst experience of my whole life. Worse than the shooting, because that was over in a matter of seconds. Whereas that tube was in there for over a week, and I still feel weird phantom pains looking at the scar where it went in. I was in the hospital for weeks, having all sorts of operations and then doing all the physiotherapy that came afterwards. I had the wife and the little one in there crying over me, which was really tough, and my little boy didn't understand what was happening at all, so it was even worse on him just not getting any of it. The peelers came around too, that's the police if you're wondering, asking me all kinds of questions that I didn't know the answers to. I didn't see any faces, I couldn't ID anyone, and I could barely even remember driving out to the old pool. The whole thing was just some blur. My time in hospital was basically one big blur too, as I had morphine for the pain, anti-anxiety too because I kept having these nightmares at first whenever I'd nod off. Visitors brought grapes and cards from the church, and then my cousin, who was a very religious person, rest her soul, brought a minister in one day to pray over me. And he said that the gun jamming was divine intervention, but I'm really not so sure. I think it was just dumb luck. Recovery took months, but eventually I came home on crutches and with my arm in a sling. The neighbors turned out like a guard of honor to welcome me home, all queued up to shake my good hand and tell me that they were glad to see me home. They brought me food over so my missus didn't have to cook, and she spent all that extra time on her hands either crying or telling me that she was going to divorce me if I didn't stop driving the taxis. She wasn't serious, I don't think, or maybe she was, who knows, but I did as she asked me all the same. I found work packing boxes in a warehouse, which was very boring but much safer, but there were still signs of what you might call PTSD today, but back then it was just stress. I'd jump at cars backfiring or doors slamming too loud, and then forget about cabbying or driving anywhere at all for that matter. I didn't get behind the wheel for a while, even when I was well enough to do it. And as you can imagine, it reminded me too much of that night. Even just holding the steering wheel in the same way I did when I was waiting caused cold sweat to collect around my neck and armpits. And then my heart would start hammering like I was about to have a heart attack, and I'd end up crawling out of the driver's seat, hyperventilating until the wife came out to bring me inside again. My mind was locked onto the shooting for months, and any spare moment I had, my mind would wander to it. I'd think about the rat bag who lured me to that car park and wondered if he was forced to do it, or he did it willingly because he was so full of hate and anger, like the same sort of wild hatred I saw in the eyes of the man who tried shooting me in the head. As far as I know, he was never caught, but even if he was, he'd probably be a free man today after the Good Friday Agreement let all kinds of thugs and killers back onto the streets. I was told that writing this out would be healthy for me, and in a way I suppose it had been, but sometimes thinking about the coincidences is enough to drive me insane. A good example would be how many things had to happen for that bastard's gun to jam twice on him. He had to buy it or get it from a guy that hardly cleaned it, and then the ammunition that he used had probably been kept in a damp place or something to try and hide it from the peelers. And so much had to happen, or not happen, for my brains to stay in my skull that night. And although I'm not a strictly religious man, it is hard not to wonder if there was some sort of higher power at work that night. My name's Lucy, and I'm a listener from the UK, and this isn't strictly my own story, but it's one that deserves to be told, and by the time you've finished reading, I'm confident that you'll agree with me. One Sunday morning, back in November of 2021, a friend of my dad's got up for work. David had worked as a cabbie for many years, so he knew the job as well as anyone, and he knew better than to work late on a Saturday night and risk someone puking in his taxi or trying to do a runner. And so instead, he used to skip the late weekends and work the mornings, which were much less rowdy and only slightly less busy. And that Sunday in particular was bound to be a good earner because it wasn't just any old Sunday, it was Remembrance Sunday. Remembrance Sunday in the UK is basically like Veterans Day in the US, a day to remember our war dead and pay our respects to them. Now, a lot of people choose to stop and stand still at 11 a.m., the same time that the guns fell silent in World War I, and have a minute's silence. And a lot of people get together at places like cathedrals or army places to lay wreaths and say prayers and stuff like that. Now, people sometimes have a drink after the services too. Nothing too wild, just a pint or two with old mates in memory of the fallen. But that means people needed taxis, so it was an ideal time for Dave to hop in his cab and go looking for fares. Now, from about 10 o'clock onwards, David started getting jobs ferrying people around the city to various church services. But he also got jobs taking one or two groups to the cathedral, which is where this big Remembrance Day ceremony was being held, probably the biggest one in the city, too. Some of the people were wearing bits of old military uniform like berets and stuff, where they were obviously veterans of old wars or off to pay tribute to their old pals. And so Dave's having this little chat with them, asking where they served and when and all of that, and then, at what must have been about 10:45, he gets a job taking someone else to the cathedral, presumably for the service. He pulls up outside a house not far from the city center, and a guy gets in the back carrying a large, heavy-filled backpack. He tells Dave that he wants to go to the cathedral, so off they go. As they're driving, Dave asks the man in the back if he's attending the Remembrance Day service. He says yes. They make a bit more small talk, and along the way somewhere, Dave runs into a bit of traffic. It turns out there's road work ahead of him, so half the road is closed off and traffic's been brought to a near standstill as everything's been reduced to one lane. Dave realizes they're going to be stuck there for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then he looks at his clock and realizes if they stay there, the man in the back is going to be late for the service. Dave turns to his passenger and says something like, I think you're cutting it a bit late here, mate. I'd just get out and walk if I were you so you don't miss the service. Now, the guy is obviously a bit annoyed, but he doesn't get angry with Dave or anything because I imagine that he knew he'd mucked up by not calling the cab earlier. Dave even said that he wouldn't charge him for how far they'd gone because it hardly seemed fair if it was him who got them stuck in traffic. And this was his first clue that something wasn't quite right because the fella didn't so much as bat an eyelid at the prospect of a free lift. Normally, people either say, "Oh, no, that's not necessary," or at the very least, "Well, thanks a lot, that's so kind." But this fella didn't offer so much as a single word of thanks and instead started looking around as if trying to figure out where he was. Dave later said that he thought the guy was just annoyed about being late for the service because he looked and sounded kind of foreign and might not have known how to get there. And so as he's looking around as if scoping out a route, Dave starts explaining how all he has to do is walk straight down the road in front of him and he can't miss the cathedral because it's so big that he'll see it if he just keeps walking. Now, you'd think the bloke would be very interested in that information, considering that he's about to be late for this thing. But apparently the same thing happened as when Dave mentioned the free ride. The guy in the back didn't seem remotely interested and just kept on looking through the windows like he was scoping the place out. Now, after about a minute of this, Dave notices the guy looking over at this huge complex of blue-gray buildings which stood on the other side of the dual carriageway. He asked Dave what it is, and when he told him it was the women's hospital, Dave listened in total confusion as the guy basically said, "Okay, drop me off there instead." Dave told him he was better jumping out of the car right there, but the guy insisted on being dropped off in front of the hospital so he could walk from there. Now, he suddenly didn't seem all that fussed about making it to the ceremony on time. He seemed more concerned with the fact that there was a maternity hospital right there next to him, and I think it was about then when Dave realized the man in the back of his cab was up to something. He didn't know if it was drugs, cheating, or something more sinister, but whenever a passenger is funny about where they're going and what they're doing, it's usually because they're up to no good, obviously. But what did a fella with a big, heavy backpack want to be dropped outside the woman's hospital for? And as he asked himself that question, I think it dawned on Dave what a bad position he was in. He didn't make a fuss or start asking questions, but what he did do was lock his cab's doors, meaning when they stopped, the fella wouldn't be able to get out without giving an actual good reason why he'd changed his destination. If he showed him what was in the bag, he'd let him out. If he didn't, well, that was a different story. Dave waits his turn to go and then turns around and takes the road into the women's hospital car park. Now, he must have been sweating buckets, and somehow he kept his cool. And then when they stopped outside the front doors, the man in the back didn't even try to pay. And this is a private hire cab that wasn't an Uber where you either pay cash or pay by card, and by the end of the ride, it doesn't automatically come out of your account or however that works on Uber. Now, most people, when they're not doing runners, pull out their wallet or some cash as they come to the stop. This fella just grabbed his bag and reached for the door handle before they'd even come to a stop yet. But when he realized the car was locked and Dave wasn't going to let him out, he reached into his bag and detonated the bomb that was in there. The explosion blew all the windows out and sent all the bits of metal the bomb contained out with it. Now, you can watch the CCTV footage of the blast on the internet, so maybe go watch it instead of me trying to describe it. But my point is, it doesn't look like there's any way in hell that either David or his passenger could have survived it. Everything inside looked like it had been blown to pieces, but somehow, I suppose by some kind of miracle with it being a Sunday, one of the cab's front doors opens just a smidge, and Dave, the taxi driver, comes stumbling out, probably with his head banging and ears ringing. Now, he's obviously had the life frightened out of him because he tries to almost run away from the scene at first. But then a fella in a high-vis jacket goes running over to him to help, and Dave stops trying to run. He's got his hand on the back of his head the whole time, and I suppose because it was burned, but also because he was checking to see if the back of his head hadn't been blown off. It hadn't, thankfully, and if you can believe it, I don't even think Dave even spent a single night in the hospital. I think the only fairly serious wounds that he got was that bit of his ear was cut off by a piece of metal from the bomb. That, and his hearing's been quite seriously affected by how loud the explosion was. On the other hand, the passenger in the back seat was blown to bits. And although someone tried to drag him out of the car thinking the whole thing had been some kind of accident, the whole car was soon on fire with flames licking out the windows and his body being burned along with the car. Finding out was horrible. My dad knew it was Dave before it was officially named because he recognized Dave's car from some of the first images released. But to find out who the bomber was, we had to wait, and it was a very confusing process. First of all, we heard his name was Enzo Almeni. But then it was announced that he changed his name while living in the UK and that his real name was Imad al-Swilmin. We were then told that he was a refugee from Syria, but then that was quickly corrected when someone found out that he was Jordanian, and that he might have been trying to cheat the asylum system by claiming that he was from Syria, which had a war going on at the time. Everyone was obviously thinking, this guy's a terrorist, nothing else to it. But then there was a weird twist to everything. Firstly, Imad had been sectioned not long after arriving in the UK, after walking around town waving a knife and shouting at people. And for the folks who don't know what sectioned means, it's when someone is detained under the Mental Health Act, not arrested as such, but detained for their own safety. He spent some time in a unit, took some medications probably, and then when he gets out, Imad decides that he wants to convert to Christianity. Apparently, he got involved with the Church of England, saying that he wanted to settle into his new home by taking the local religion and changing his name. And then when we found out which church it was literally chilling because it wasn't a church. The place Imad had been planning on attacking was the very same place he'd been going to undergo his conversion. And as you can imagine, everyone found it outrageous, but it was all a massive headache for everyone too, because who was this fella? Was he like an actual terrorist or just a mental case? And then from what I can tell, it was a case of him not being a terrorist and then suddenly was a terrorist. I think he would have done or said just about anything to stay in the United Kingdom, to the point some people think that he faked that mental breakdown with a knife so they wouldn't be able to deport him because of all that human rights stuff. It definitely looked like he faked his conversion, or that he at least changed his mind about it, because he stopped going to the cathedral a few months after he was finally confirmed as a Christian. Apparently he'd been baptized 2 years before, but the priests or vicars or whoever wanted to make sure that he was for real. And they had him coming back for years before they finally confirmed him. But it seems that might have been nothing more than an attempt to trick the immigration services because, like I said, he stopped visiting not long after. And I heard that 2 days before the attack, Imad called his brother in America and told him he was planning on doing something bad, quote-unquote, as he put it. And that proves the whole thing was planned ahead. And then, when the police searched his flat, they found evidence that he'd been building the bomb for months before the attack was ready to go. And the fact that he chose to attack on a Sunday, and Remembrance Sunday too, has a scary sort of significance to it considering all the conversion stuff. And then we found out that after his flat was searched, police found a prayer mat and a Quran and all of that, so he obviously switched back to Islam before he tried to go through with his plan. Now, I just wanted to say that some of my best mates in school growing up were Muslims, and the fella in the shop around the corner from us is from Yemen, and he's one of the nicest guys you could hope to meet. And so this isn't me trying to bash anyone by telling the story, as I know they're not all like that, and I know not all asylum seekers are out to take advantage of a system meant to help people. But we gotta be more careful, because psychos like Imad are out there willing to do and say anything to try and cheat that system, and when they don't get their own way, they're finally told no.